I want to make this point clear. Your relationship is full of hatred if the harmful behaviors are prolonged and consistent. That's the main takeaway. If there are ongoing verbal insults, belittling comments and remarks, and acts of physical violence, yes, then we could say that that's a relationship that's tinged with hatred. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder, a podcast that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, we're going to talk about navigating the complexities of narcissistic relationships, but we're going to focus specifically on distinguishing between anger, rage, and hatred. We're going to tackle three pivotal questions that frequently emerge in discussions on, in my field, this is what we call narcissistic rage. First, how do we distinguish between healthy and unhealthy expressions of anger? Following that, we will address the second question. What gets triggered in a person pulled into, again, in the literature, this is what's commonly called counter control. So what gets triggered? Why does one engage in counter control? In other words, someone's trying to control them and they begin to try to control the other person. And finally, we will explore the third question. How do you make some inroads with a narcissist? Now, since that's too broad of a question for us to tackle in this one episode, because as you all know, there are various facets of narcissism, I want to look at that question specifically in terms of how do we make some inroads in terms of narcissistic rage, since the topic today is really on distinguishing and then treatment of, or how do we make these inroads into addressing problems around rage, anger, rage, and hatred. Okay, so the recurring theme, and this is in the psychoanalytic literature, is the acknowledgement that anger spans on a spectrum, encompassing both overt, destructive behaviors and more subtle, nuanced expressions. Let's give an example. Something that I think will help distinguish between healthy and unhealthy forms of, let's say, anger, or at least the way anger gets expressed. Picture this scenario. Let's say you're, at the airport and you're patiently waiting online and somebody cuts in front of you. Or alternatively, let's say you're in your car and you're in the exit lane waiting patiently to get off of the parkway and someone at the last minute comes over and cuts in front of you. In both of these examples, if you experience anger, you'll feel frustrated. You'll maybe honk your horn. Perhaps you'll shake your head or use some mild language, to vent some irritation. But the main point is your reaction is not going to put yourself or somebody else in harm's way. There's no danger there. Now, conversely, picture the same scenario. You're online at the airport, right? And someone cuts in front of you. And we want to look at rage, right? To distinguish it between anger. So if we're going to define this as a rageful response, the most important thing is that it's more intense, it's more extreme, and the expression is more impulsive, right? So now if somebody cuts in front of you and with the car, let's say, you may aggressively lean on that horn. And if there's rage, and I'm sure all of you heard this, by the way, road rage, right? You may actually maneuver your car to try to get in front of them or drive aggressively. Or alternatively, if someone cuts in front of you online, you may accidentally, I'm using air quotes for the word accidentally, bump them, right? You may have some choice words for them. But the main point is that what distinguishes the two is that in ordinary anger, you still have the capacity to think and behave in somewhat of a rational way. and it's not as impulsive, right? You're not acting impulsively. Whereas with rage, you lose the capability of thought and you're more responsive and impulsive. It's like something comes over you, and for that moment, it feels like you cannot control it. So now you're yelling, maybe you're acting physically aggressive, right? Okay, but let's even go one step further. Let's say you're online, right, at the airport, or you're on the exit ramp. This is an example of hatred, which is even a more severe form. The main difference with hatred is we say that it's more prolonged. In other words, there's a persistent sort of negative emotion that you cannot let go of. So if someone cuts you off in the car, it will involve everything that I've described so far with anger and rage. Well, actually, no, let me correct that. It will not actually involve the anger, because the anger, like I said, there's some capacity to think through something in a way that could potentially be constructive. So let's say the hatred involves everything that I described with the rage, but now you can't let this go. It's building up inside of you. There's a deep sense of resentment because there's no working through any of this. So you may write down the license plate number of the person who cut you off. Maybe you have a friend who's, I don't know, a police officer or a detective of some sort, or you're really good at doing online research. Maybe you'll even you'll write down the license plate number, and you'll do some research, and maybe you'll find out where this person lives, and you'll go and key their car or something. You see, I'm making this up. You could obviously fill it in with your own example. But I think you get the sense with hatred, it's far more pronounced. It's longer lasting. It doesn't relent easily. So that person who cut you off, that you had some choice words for, online at the airport, you may actually try to follow them. Or if you're online, let's say, this is a better example, at the grocery store, you may follow them to their car with the same sort of intent or motive in mind, that maybe you're going to key their car or do some damage to their car. Maybe you'll even follow them home and try to figure out where they live. So while anger can be a natural and even a healthy response, hatred is considered more destructive, like rage. In my field, this is what we call narcissistic rage, and will have long term consequences. Okay. So now that we have the basics down, let's dig into some real life examples of how these emotions show up or could potentially show up in your relationship. As always, the stories I share are authentic, but to protect the anonymity of the individuals involved, some events are combined to create an immersive experience for the listeners. When he looks at the credit card statement, he discovers a big purchase she made. He thinks he handles it well. Despite feeling betrayed, he attempts to talk to her about her decision to spend so much money without discussing it with him. She begins to feel accused and attacked and refuses to talk to him when he's interrogating her word. He's interrogating her. So she shuts down emotionally. When she shuts down, he steps forward. It's very common. She takes a step back. He takes a step forward. He becomes assaultive. It escalates quickly. He starts yelling. He's screaming. And when she tells him he has a serious problem and he needs to leave, he punches a wall or bangs on the table. Here, you could fill it in with whatever example is most relevant to you. But the basic picture is it begins to escalate. So he bangs on a table. Maybe he slams things around in the kitchen. He then starts to accuse and attack her. So you could picture this scenario. She's yelling at him that he has a problem. He needs to get out. He's telling her that she's being manipulative and sneaky, that she's addicted to spending. And this quickly escalates. And he tells her she's hurting the family by spending all the money. I don't know. Again, you could fill this in because I think you can imagine this scenario. You've probably you've been in this or you've seen this kind of scenario before. Now, she wants to get away from him because she feels threatened and she wants to exit the room and he's yelling at her. So he blocks the door now. And then she tries to push her way through. This, again, very common. And he grabs her. And then he blocks her from leaving. In other iterations, he grabs her. He pushes her. He pushes her on the bed, or she pushes him. He puts her hands on her. Again, this is just all different ways, different iterations to show how this escalates. But this is also where a deeper analysis is both important and necessary, because there are a few ways to look at this scenario. Now, first of all, is this hatred, rage, or is this anger? Those are the three things I said we want to discuss today. Now, in order to answer that question, we would need to better understand his motives. If the conflict escalates to a point where one partner expresses an intense desire to physically harm or eliminate the other, we're talking about an extreme level of hatred. This could manifest in actual acts of physical violence or acts of aggression with the intent to cause severe harm, and of course, in some cases, even death. That's an extreme level of hatred. So let's see. Let's break this one down. Let's look at the different components. The initial shock of finding the undisclosed charge on the credit card likely triggered intense anger in him. Anger is a natural emotion, right? I mentioned this a little bit earlier. This is a response to what? A perceived injustice of some sort, or a frustration, feeling slighted in some way. And in this case, it seems to have escalated quickly beyond a manageable level. So not diagnostically, but in terms of treatment, that already tells us quite a bit, which is that he doesn't have the inner resources to sublimate the anger. And when I say sublimate, I mean make use of it symbolically through what? The act of language, talking about it, so that then the anger is healthy. But what we see is the act of what? Yelling and physically punching a wall or slamming things around or putting his hands on her. Now, this is a form of rage. So we move from anger to rage. Remember, I said I kind of tried to put them on a continuum a little bit earlier. This is now the expression of aggression. So now we have rage and aggression. And this behavior goes beyond verbal expression and indicates physical manifestations of intense emotions in him that he cannot regulate. Why am I emphasizing this? Because this will become the first order of business when we're thinking about how do we make inroads? What are we going to treat? What are we going to address? These are the things we begin to address. His capacity to symbolize, his capacity to use verbal language, his capacity to help himself get more into a regulated state of mind. This is all part of the work. Also suggests that the anger has intensified to a level that's not only concerning, but also poses a risk of harm to her. A critical piece of this, which is actually missing from the descriptive data, is what happens next. How is this resolved? Also, what we don't know is how often does this happen? Maybe this is a very rare situation that happened to come at a time when there was quite a bit of stress in both of their lives. Or maybe they just returned from an extensive travel. There could be so many things that are going on that left them both emotionally more susceptible to this, right? So we need to look at that too. How often does this happen? How often does it escalate to this level of violence? And what happens in between acts of disagreement and violence? Now, all of these things are important, again, diagnostically, to really understand what's going on here. On the surface, this scenario, as described, involves rage and aggression. See, I left out anger. but it doesn't necessarily imply the presence of hatred. To label the scenario as involving hatred, there would need to be more evidence of a deeper, more persistent, and pervasive animosity extending beyond the immediate disagreement and manifesting a consistent pattern of harmful behavior. Like, for instance, you or your partner hold a grudge. Like, do you hold a grudge, or does your partner hold a grudge? Never seem to let things go. Do they just seem to keep coming up? That is more of a sign of hatred. There's no level of forgiveness. There's no retribution. There's no repairing the damage. For both of you, like for you, let me say for you or your partner, if you hold a grudge, there's no real movement beyond what? Bitterness, resentment. The grudge never seems to get resolved. Or alternatively, you could say, all right, if you're thinking about your own relationship or somebody that you know who's in this kind of relationship, you can also ask the question, all right, if it gets resolved, does it then quickly just move to another problem? In other words, is there a consistent pattern of bitterness and resentment, if you know what I mean? I want to make this point clear. Your relationship is full of hatred if the harmful behaviors are prolonged and consistent. That's the main takeaway. If there are ongoing verbal insults, belittling comments and remarks, and acts of physical violence, yes, then we could say that that's a relationship that's tinged with hatred. In this case that I just described, it seems there was narcissistic rage and a ton of aggression, plus intense motives to control her spending. This is very common among individuals, by the way, with narcissistic traits. Because what happened? I'm sure you heard this already, but it's worth just pulling to the fore. He does not like that she did something outside of his awareness. We know people with narcissistic characteristics are very vulnerable to something happening separate from them when somebody has a mind of their own. And that's what she demonstrated with the purchases. She was spending the money, making decisions without him. And this enraged him. That's what we came to discover. And that's eventually what we began to discuss. It was not just about spending money. That's the part I see. The money is sort of the manifest content. And it's so important to get beyond the act of spending money to understand what's really going on here. And in each case, it's different. But in this example that I'm giving you today, it's that she asserted her own sense of autonomy, which typically will drive a narcissist crazy. Now, it's also important to note that in healthy relationships, as I mentioned a couple moments ago, there's healthy anger. And if there's healthy anger, generally you can avoid such extreme and destructive behaviors. Why? Because we could talk about things. That's the use of language. That's what happens when there's adequate impulse control. In reality, conflicts in healthy relationships are usually resolved through what? Communication, open communication, and compromise. And you come to some kind of mutual understanding. In my online research that I did, I heard that these controlling narcissists get into relationships because the very core of their being depends on having someone they can manipulate, attack, control, and annihilate. And by the way, when I say online research, what I mean is when I turn to the social media content. Now, it's true, there are malignant narcissists and even sociopaths out there. And that's why I really wanted to take the time today. And so hopefully in your mind, you can begin to distinguish between what? Anger, rage, and hate. Hate. Now, hate is more common amongst the more severely disturbed types or clusters of narcissism. Narcissistic rage and anger are more common. Narcissistic rage and anger are more common amongst narcissistically disturbed individuals. Hate is more common amongst those who are severely disturbed, if that makes sense. So, while there are those malignant narcissists out there, of course, there's no doubt, but the majority of those who suffer with narcissistic characteristics, from what I have seen and from in my own practice and all the examples that I'm listening to online during my social media content review, what I could say is they are not all evil. Not all narcissists are evil. And just like in all of us, there's a bit in every one of us. I'm sorry to say this, but there is a bit of us, a little piece that can get crazy sometimes when we're strained or we're stressed enough, right? We're all prone to regression. We have regressive moments where we can't control our impulses. We lose our capacity for symbolization. We lose our words and we lash out. So if we can agree to that, then why can we not agree that even in the angriest people, there's a piece of them that's what longs for a healthy attachment. So just like there's an angry piece in us, our capacity for all of us to get angry, well, let me not just say angry, but full of rage, right? Why can we not say that there's a piece in them that can get filled with love? Now, I know a lot of the social media content out there does not focus on this because oftentimes, more often than not, it's always, well, let me hold off. I'm about to digress again, but I'll get into this when we talk about how to make inroads. So let me get back on track because I've been talking quite extensively in my prior episodes about the origins of narcissism. And while there is excessive frustration with parental figures, and oftentimes there's early trauma, abuse, and neglect, you may have noticed that I always said, and if I didn't, I meant to always say, in these individuals, there's more hate as compared to love. But I think now you could see, based on what I'm telling you today, although I didn't say this directly at the time, I didn't emphasize this. What I said implies that there is some love, or at least a desire. Maybe that's a more appropriate way for me to phrase it. There is at least a desire for a healthy attachment, to be attached in a loving way. Because remember what I said, there's more hate than love, but there is the capacity for this loving attachment. Let's delve into the second question now and consider what's getting triggered inside of that person who gets pulled into that counter control. Now, I use this language because, again, this is what I pick up on when I do my social media content review, basically my online review. They call it counter control. A quick side note, if you caught any of my earlier episodes, like the one on trauma bonded relationships, you'll find an in-depth discussion on the control, counter-control dynamic. I went into that in far more detail. I explored how it's linked to issues like boredom, emptiness, and difficulty recognizing and mourning a loss. So, to answer that question, what gets triggered inside of that person who gets pulled into the counter control? You have to think about trauma bonded relationships and go back to prior episodes and listen to this whole thing about the incapacity, right? Not even recognizing a loss. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. Let's return to the example I gave with this guy who looks at the credit card statement, discovers the big purchase, feels betrayed, attempts to talk to his partner, and ends up interrogating her, and then things spiral quickly, as I described earlier. Think about this example. Who is being controlled here? Who is getting pulled in and who is counter controlling? On the surface, because he gets violent and because he controls her spending, according to her, it seems like he is the controlling narcissist. And this is partly true. He is partly controlling. So, yes, he's controlling her. and he doesn't like it. He says, I felt betrayed. Remember, we spoke about this earlier. When she has a mind of her own, he doesn't like that. And then he needs to control her. So she's not free. So she can't function autonomously. However, if they have a budget and an agreement around spending, and she goes ahead and spends a large amount of money without consulting with him, is that not manipulative behavior? Is that not controlling? Is that not deceptive? See, one can argue that she would not need to do that, right? You could argue with me and say, look, she wouldn't need to do this if he wasn't so controlling. And we worked on this, by the way. This is one of the things we work on in treatment. And I would say to you, that's also true. So if you're saying to me, how can you say all these things are true? My short answer to that is this stuff is complicated. It's never one thing or the other. It's never just one person's fault, and this is the bad guy, and this is the good guy. This stuff is this is much more complicated. To blame the man in this situation is easy, and it seems so obvious given his behavior, which of course was not appropriate. But we can work on that. In fact, that is the goal, to help each of them recognize, which at the moment is not completely conscious, by the way, but we need to help them recognize their own emotional triggers and reroute them into healthier forms of anger. And that would be wonderful if we can have anger instead of narcissistic rage and what may be hate in this relationship, which is, we still didn't have a conclusion on that. So this leads us right into the third question. So we're almost done. This is the third, 3 out of 3, okay? Which is, and I kind of answered this already, but how do we make inroads with a narcissist? Remember I said, let me refine that question a little bit and say, how do we make inroads with narcissistic rage, which is a big part, by the way. It's one of the functions. It's one of the components of narcissism, narcissistic rage. How do we make inroads? My online research on social media content, again, you know the answer to this already. Here's the number one answer. You can't make inroads. You need to get out of the relationship. So you need to leave. Number 2 answer, create boundaries. Don't get me started on that. I already sort of went on a digression about that. Okay. And then this is another thing I heard. You need to know who you are. So let's go back to the example and begin to wrap this up. She's harboring intense resentment, firmly convinced that her grievances are entirely justified because he tries to control her spending. He blames her for the ongoing conflicts, attributing them to what he sees as her impulsive behavior around spending, right? She has an addiction. So she withdraws from him, not acknowledging that she's shutting down. So she shuts down. She feels blamed, shuts down, right? And when he confronted her about her aggressive communication, and by the way, is shutting down aggressive? Well, some people would call that, there's a concept, I think it's called stonewalling. And I could say that might be aggressive because she knows, by the way, that when she shuts down, he feels abandoned and that inflames him. Maybe that's aggressive, but she deflects responsibility, claiming that her shutting down is a reaction to his mistreatment. So you see what I'm getting at here is I just went over this because they're both basically blaming the other. And this is where we start, right? They both feel the other person is responsible. So here's the work. Here's how we make inroads into this. I help her become curious because there's no curiosity about her spending habits. So I help her become curious about how there's no discussion prior to her spending very large sums of money and subsequently forgetting, I'm using air quotes, forgetting to tell him. And I use air quotes because from a psychoanalytic perspective, sometimes we just forget things, but sometimes forgetting is a motivated act. In other words, it's not so innocent. When she withdraws, he acts aggressively. This is the narcissistic rage, right? To the abandonment. And he becomes more enraged and he tries to engage her, right? That's the thing. Is like he tries to force her to talk to him. Why? So he doesn't feel abandoned and doesn't have to deal with loss. But this inflames the situation. So how do we make an inroad into narcissistic rage? Initially, he failed to acknowledge his own role in shaping the dynamics, just like she did. I just mentioned this. She plays her own role in making these big purchases and then lying or hiding. And he plays his role in shaping these dynamics in the relationship. In other words, there is no sense of active agency connected with his role in creating the problems. He was simply activated by her and justified almost in the way he was behaving. Now, over time, I help him begin to see this differently, just like I helped her begin to think about her forgetting. He then becomes more apologetic and expresses remorse over the way he explodes. And he starts exploding far less frequently. He's better able to contain himself because now he has a capacity to use words. There's still a side of him, though, that harbors anger and resentment over her spending patterns. So further work needs to be done on that. So we begin to explore and we become to recognize that his attacks and blame stem from a deep sense of feeling abandoned by her, right? They're not on the same team when she's spending the money. She's not consulting with him or when she shuts down. And if he's not getting the emotional support he needs, that's when he tries to force her to talk to him. Anyway, you could see we could get some good work done with this fellow. And he begins to use language and he becomes more thoughtful. He becomes less impulsive. He begins to understand how abandoned he feels. And even that can be questioned. So in this particular example, this answer, because the answer to this question, like how do we make inroads into this or into narcissistic rage, it will of course vary depending on the relationship dynamics and the intrapsychic dynamics. That's why, again, I'm sorry to keep saying this, but that's why this stuff is complicated. But this is, I hope I'm giving you an example of how we begin to make inroads. So for him, we begin to see, label, and talk about his deep fears of abandonment and rejection, his fears of being alone, losing her, and feeling painfully unloved. We are not a team. For her, it reached a peak around an incident where he was calling her and she didn't pick up the phone. She ignored his calls. When I explored this, what we came to see is it gave her pleasure, she said, to know that she could control him rather than always having him as the one in charge. See, that's really important to note, that she also has her own sadistic wishes. This is almost like her own narcissistic rage. She could disown this, though, you see. This is really critical, is she could disavow this part of herself by thinking that he's the one who's driven by the wish to control. But she has her own rage and her own need to control him. Okay? But that's how it gets disavowed. Now, she puts that all in him. He acts like, like I described earlier, with getting out of control. And that's a wonderful solution because now she doesn't have to own any of this. So she's angry and provocative in subtle ways. She's both the victim when he, goes after her, but she's also the troublemaker. But it's easier to see the victim because he gets so angry, overtly aggressive. But as we get that under control, what we see is she's a troublemaker, if that makes sense, right? But it's difficult, but it's so necessary it's such a necessary task to focus on the aggression and provocative behavior, because this is coming from both of them. It's not just him. Anyway, so I hope I answered that question. How do we make inroads into narcissism, or what I've called into narcissistic rage? And here's the short answer. It's the interpretive effort, right? That was what the goal was, to connect the split off aspects in each partner. Both of them could not own their own level of control, their own sense of anger and hostility, I should say, not even anger, hostility, rage, because they're so busy putting it in the other person. This is what we call projection. You may have heard me use this word before. So let me just sum it up I'll say it slightly differently. Hate in him provokes hate in her, and hate in her provokes hate in him. Welcome to the world of projective identification, folks. So maybe that's a good place for us to leave it. From a psychodynamic perspective, distinguishing between anger, rage, what I call narcissistic rage, and hatred in the context of relationship dynamics holds significant importance. In delving into this nuanced exploration, I hope I demonstrated to all of you how to make inroads into these complicated dynamics. But unfortunately, as always, we have to stop there for today. But you've heard me say this before. This stuff is so complicated and it may be confusing. If I said anything to confuse you today, I really encourage you to reach out with any questions you may have, any comments, any observations. Shoot me an email, leave me a comment. I'll be sure to respond to it, or maybe I'll even pick it up in a future episode. Until next time, you always hear me say this at the end, engage your mind. But now I think I can add a little something to this based on this clinical material. Instead of just engage your mind, I think I'm going to turn this into engage your mind, not your weapon. In other words, don't turn it into a fight. It's very easy to fight and project. So engage your mind, not your weapon. Until next time, I will see you then. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.